Ever had your day hijacked by a piece of mail? I was halfway through a half-warm bagel thinking about whether I needed new brake pads when I pulled a letter from the mailbox that changed everything. It wasn't a bill, and it sure wasn't that pizza coupon I was hoping for. Big red letters across the top screamed like a siren. Violation notice. Immediate action required. And just like that, the only road to my house, the one my family had used since back when gas was $1 a gallon, was now considered unauthorized access. According to the letter, I had 30 days to find a new way to reach my front door. Unless I owned a helicopter or a machete, that wasn't happening. The notice was signed, of course, by Elaine Prescott, HOA president and self-declared ruler of all things paved and petty in Willeridge Lakeside. What followed was far from what anyone expected. You're about to see how an old Marine with a bulldozer and a whole lot of heart made sure things didn't stay that way. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this story unfolds. Leave a comment below and hit like if you're curious to see what happens next. The violation notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, tucked between my electric bill and a pizza coupon like it belonged there. Now, I'd heard of Elaine before. The way people talked about her at the local diner, you'd think she was a Bond villain disguised as a realtor. Word was, after a messy divorce from a Dallas developer, she moved into our neighborhood like it was a hostile takeover. Clipboard in hand, marching in heels sharp enough to aerate a lawn, she set out to transform our peaceful cul-de-sac into her own suburban monarchy. I didn't know her personally, but I knew her type. Someone who thought power came from paperwork and justice lived in the fine print. Her yard was immaculate, her smile was tight, and her rules? Let's just say she treated the HOA handbook like scripture carved on stone tablets. My driveway wasn't a violation, it was a challenge to her authority, and I had apparently become public enemy number one for daring to exist with an unpermitted road. I figured maybe, just maybe, this was a misunderstanding. So I called City Hall and got Mike Rodriguez, the zoning guy who always sounded like he was running late to retirement. "Mason," he said, "unless you've got recorded easement rights, she's within her rights to issue the notice." He paused, then added, "You're not the first to call. She's been on a bit of a streak lately." A streak? That woman was issuing violations like Oprah hands out giveaways. Everyone gets a fine. You get a warning, you get a notice for your trash cans being visible from space. I thanked Mike and hung up, now officially concerned that I might need a lawyer, a surveyor, and, possibly, an exorcist. That road had been laid in 1985 by my grandfather and a few of the old-timers. Before Elaine ever set foot in Willeridge, but apparently, history had no bearing in a world ruled by forms, fences, and fine-tooth combs. So I did what any desperate man with coffee jitters and a rising blood pressure would do. I started digging. Not the good kind with shovels and closure, the bad kind, musty file drawers, plastic bins, yellowing papers that hadn't seen daylight since the Clinton administration. My grandfather, bless his soul, kept every receipt he ever touched. Tools, tires, even a return receipt for a 1988 toaster oven. But when it came to legal easements, the cabinet gave me nothing but dust and a mild allergy attack. I called my mom to ask if she remembered any paperwork. "Nope," she said. "They just built it. No fuss, no permit, just grit and gravel." Of course, built like everything back then, handshake agreements and stubborn resolve, which doesn't do a whole lot of good when someone's threatening $500, 0 cents a day fines with a legal team on speed dial. That's when I called Frank. My grandfather. Builder. Marine. Bulldozer owner. 78 years old and still more dangerous with a wrench than most men are with a law degree. "Elaine Prescott," he said, his voice calm like the eye of a hurricane. "That woman's about to learn the difference between authority and power." I filled him in, from the letter to the non-existent paperwork. He didn't even hesitate. We're not rolling over for some lady with a printer and a superiority complex. That's how Frank talks, no drama, just declarations. To him, this wasn't a zoning issue, it was a family line in the sand. The road wasn't just gravel, it was the thread connecting generations. And when someone comes to cut that thread, you don't schedule a meeting. You start tracing the roots. and prepare to dig deeper. Little did I know we weren't just going to fight this, we were about to bulldoze it. Literally. I figured if I was going to fight an HOA dictator, I needed intel, real stories from the front lines. So I headed down the road to see Leo Haskins, who lived 3 houses over, and had that look of a man who'd seen things he couldn't unsee. Leo was the guy with the giant oak tree in his front yard, a tree so big it looked like it had been there since the Alamo, or at least it had been, until Elaine got a bug in her ear about unauthorized height encroachment. She made him cut it down, not trim it, not shape it, cut it. The kicker? The rule she cited was meant for fence posts. That tree had shaded generations of porch sitters, barbecue dads, and summer lemonade stands. Now, it was mulch. Leo's face was the kind you remember. Creased, tired, like someone who used to smile but got fined for it. His voice cracked when he said, "She made me watch as they hauled it off in pieces. That wasn't regulation. That was revenge." And I knew right then, this wasn't about rules. This was about control. And Leo wasn't her first victim. Next, I knocked on Ruth Callahan's door. Ruth is what you'd call neighborhood royalty. Widowed, 82, and sharp enough to fold you into a logic pretzel before you finish your first sentence. She answered wearing gardening gloves and holding a pair of shears, like she'd been prepping for battle. I asked if she'd had any trouble with the HOA lately. She laughed, dry as tumbleweed, and said, "Son, I got fined $200 last spring for hanging my laundry the wrong direction." Apparently, the line was supposed to run east-west, not north-south. Because, sunsets affect sock drying now. She wasn't kidding. Elaine had dug up some obscure paragraph buried in the HOA manual and used it like a sniper's bullet. Ruth had lived in that house since before the HOA was even a thought, and suddenly her clothesline orientation was a safety hazard. I thanked her, but as I left, I felt something crawling under my skin. If this woman could weaponize compass points, she could justify just about anything. I needed to know how deep this went. That night, I sat down with a stack of HOA paperwork thick enough to kill a squirrel if dropped from shoulder height. My goal wasn't just to defend my road. I wanted to know exactly what kind of kingdom Elaine thought she was running. What I found read less like neighborhood guidelines and more like a manifesto. Pages of rules, revisions, and fine print that looked like it had been edited more times than the Bible. Violations for exterior paint that was too expressive. Fines for parking a truck in your own driveway if the tires weren't turned at an HOA-approved angle. And buried in there, like a booby trap in a brochure, were references to a compliance volunteer program. That's when it hit me. Elaine had built herself a squad, neighbors turned enforcers, a little HOA militia armed with clipboards, measuring tape, and probably a group chat titled Order First. No wonder everyone was walking on eggshells. She didn't just rule the neighborhood, she deputized it. I wasn't dealing with bureaucracy, I was dealing with a regime. And regimes don't go down easy. I needed backup. The kind that didn't blink and didn't scare. So I called Frank. I laid out what I'd learned. Leo's tree, Ruth's clothesline, the HOA army of clipboard commandos. He listened without interrupting, which usually meant he was either polishing a wrench or loading a point. "You ever see how termites work?" he asked. "They don't tear the place down all at once, they nibble. Quiet, slow, invisible. Then one day, the roof collapses and people act surprised." I could hear his pencil scratching on a pad. "You got termites, Mason. And you're going to need more than a lawsuit. You need a spotlight. You find the pattern, and you shine the hell out of it." That was Frank's way. He didn't waste time yelling in the dark. He flipped on the lights. We didn't need to match Elaine's pettiness. We needed to expose her pattern. And now I knew, without a doubt, she had one. The next morning, I made copies of every document that even smelled like abuse. I printed photos, highlighted inconsistencies, mapped fines by address. The HOA manual was now a crime scene, and I had the yarn and thumbtacks to prove it. Elaine's HOA wasn't a neighborhood association, it was a country club for control freaks, with bylaws as weapons and passive aggression as currency. And the worst part? People were so afraid of being targeted, they'd stopped talking to each other. It wasn't just about lawns or laundry, it was about isolation, divide and control. But that fear? It was starting to crack. Leo, Ruth, and a handful of others were beginning to whisper again, and whispers, if you collect enough of them, turn into noise. I didn't know what was coming next, but I had a feeling Elaine Prescott was about to learn that some people don't fold just because the rules say press. So if you think a retired Marine with a bulldozer, a box of old maps, and zero tolerance for nonsense is just gonna sit this one out, think again, because next, we're firing up something louder than a complaint letter and heavier than HOA politics. Hit that subscribe button, tap the bell, and stick around. You won't want to miss what Frank does when concrete meets conviction. When Frank says, "I've got an idea," either brace for brilliance or back up slowly. This time, it was both. He showed up at my place with a leather binder older than me, filled with survey maps, tax ledgers, and handwritten notes from when the road was first carved out in 1985. Turns out, Grandpa and a few neighbors had pooled their own money, no city funds, no HOA grants, and paid a local crew to lay that gravel path because the township wouldn't do it. Frank even found a faded invoice signed by the original contractor and a cocktail napkin with a sketch of the easement lines drawn in black marker. "Elaine's fence is sitting on history," he muttered, tapping the map like it was a treasure chart, "and history doesn't like to be moved." For the first time in weeks, the air felt less like fog and more like wind. Something was shifting. Something was coming. And Frank was the front line. Elaine, meanwhile, had shifted into full Empress mode. One morning, we woke up to the sound of post-hole diggers and diesel generators. A crew was installing cedar panels and steel beams like they were fortifying a military checkpoint. By lunchtime, half the road was sealed off with a 6-foot wall, and someone had mounted floodlights high enough to tan your skin at midnight. Motion sensors. Night vision. It felt less like a safety precaution and more like she was filming a sequel to HOA, Homeland Security. You couldn't even walk your dog without triggering a spotlight or getting recorded from 3 angles. She wasn't protecting property values. She was burning them at the altar of her ego. It was control disguised as compliance, and no one was buying the illusion anymore. But buying out of it? That was going to cost us. Word spread fast. Elaine had filed for an emergency injunction to keep the fence standing. Her claim? That the road posed a public hazard and unregulated traffic burden. That would have been hilarious if it hadn't landed us in the middle of legal quicksand. That's when Nora Reyes stepped into the picture. Real estate attorney, lived 2 streets over, no patience for nonsense, and a reputation for making city clerks cry in 3 words or less. Nora reviewed Frank's documents, cross-checked the plat maps, and confirmed what we'd hoped. The road was a legally recognized private easement, older than the HOA and outside their jurisdiction. Then she leaned back and said, "You're right, but being right's the cheap part. Fighting it, that's going to cost you." Apparently, legal truth and legal outcomes are 2 different beasts, and both bite hard. Still, it was something. Finally, we had firepower, and even if we couldn't afford to go full courtroom drama, Elaine now knew she wasn't pushing paper against amateurs. But Elaine didn't slow down. She doubled down. By the weekend, 3 more residents received violation notices for things like non-regulation wind chimes and improperly coiled hoses. Ruth got cited for having excessive bird activity in her yard. Leo got fined for a reflective mailbox surface. You'd think we were living under a satire. But the HOA was real, and Elaine had weaponized it like a jealous bureaucrat with a vengeance complex. Her strategy was clear: isolate, intimidate, and fracture any sense of neighborly unity. The community wasn't just being fined, we were being psychologically worn down, one arbitrary rule at a time. But the thing about pressure? It reveals cracks, but it also exposes steel, and I was starting to see it in my neighbors' eyes. This wasn't just my road anymore, it was our line in the dirt. That night, Frank and I sat in his garage, surrounded by blueprints, flashlight batteries, and a thermos of something that probably violated state caffeine laws. "You know," he said, "a fence is only as strong as the silence around it, and this one's getting mighty loud." I smiled, but inside, I knew he was right. Elaine had the clipboard, we had the community, she had rules, we had roots, and once you pull back the curtain on a bully, their whole circus starts to look small. But we weren't done yet, not by a long shot, because when Elaine found out that Nora was involved and Frank had evidence, she went from HOA president to HOA panic room. And panic, as Frank reminded me, makes people sloppy. We were getting close to something big enough to shake her little empire. But the question now wasn't just what Elaine was trying to control, it was what she was trying to hide. Elaine called it an emergency HOA meeting. I called it damage control with a slideshow. She booked the community center for a Thursday night and made sure her legal counsel, 2 board members, and a guy in a suit who looked like he charged by the syllable were all there. I showed up late on purpose, and the place was packed. Folks who hadn't attended a meeting in 10 years were lined up in folding chairs, clutching their coffee mugs like they were shields. Elaine stood front and center in a navy mule pantsuit, armed with a wireless clicker and a laminated agenda. You'd think she was running for Congress. The screen lit up with the first slide: perimeter security and liability risk reduction. Her voice droned on about compliance, property value preservation, and ununified neighborhood vision. But all I could think was, this wasn't a meeting. This was a PowerPoint hostage situation. And the audience? They were getting restless. She'd barely made it to slide 3 when Ruth Callahan raised her hand, then skipped the formality and stood right up. "The only hazard here is your mouth, Elaine," she said, voice sharp enough to pierce Kevlar. That cracked the room like a dropped mirror. Someone actually clapped. Elaine tried to continue, but the tide had turned. People started murmuring, then speaking, then standing. Leo told the oak tree story again. A mom from down the block brought up a $75 0-cent fine for having excessively whimsical holiday decorations. Someone else mentioned being threatened over a faded garden gnome. The room flipped from fear to fury in minutes. No more eye contact avoidance, no more whispered complaints. We weren't attending an HOA meeting, we were holding a public reckoning. And Elaine? She looked like a game show host watching the prize wheel catch fire. Meanwhile, Frank had been busy. While Elaine dazzled us with bullet points and buzzwords, he'd been pacing the length of the newly erected fence with a tape measure, a flashlight, and the steely calm of a man born to call nonsense exactly what it is. He came back with the kind of smirk that meant he'd found something good. 60 feet of this mess is built on public right-of-ways, he whispered to me, holding up a folded county map. And that corner post? It's technically obstructing a drainage corridor. Translation? Illegal. Not just pushy, not just mean, illegally built. That fence didn't just smell bad, it violated civil code. And Frank had the receipts, literally, which meant Elaine's wall of authority was less of a fortress and more of a house of cards. All it needed now was a good breeze. That breeze came faster than expected. Elaine, panicking over the crowd's mutiny, hired a private security company to preserve order. The next morning, we woke up to see a uniformed rent-a-cop standing next to the fence like he was guarding the crown jewels. He had sunglasses, a clipboard, and the blank expression of a man paid hourly to care just enough. Meanwhile, Nora and I were putting together our next move. We drafted a formal complaint citing the illegal construction, and Nora started collecting neighbors' statements for a class action challenge. That's when Frank dropped the real hammer. He'd been snooping through publicly available HOA expense reports and found entries that screamed fraud louder than a megaphone at midnight. There were consulting fees paid to Elaine's divorce attorney, wellness retreats listed under leadership training, even a line item for executive lodging at a local spa that had exactly zero to do with community improvement. Elaine hadn't just been enforcing rules, she'd been funding her fall from grace with neighborhood dues. And then came the moment no one saw coming. but everyone would remember. Elaine returned to the site with her lawyer, clipboard in hand, ready to inspect compliance readiness. But in her effort to assert dominance, she stepped a little too far back while addressing the gathering crowd. Her kitten heels caught the edge of a support trench, and down she went, into a waist-deep hole filled with Texas clay and construction runoff. She emerged looking like a rejected garden statue, hair matted, blazer soaked, one hand still clutching the clipboard like it could save her dignity. You could hear gasps, stifled laughter, and somewhere behind me, Leo popped open a soda like it was opening night at the theater. Even the security guard turned away to hide a smile. Ruth offered her a towel out of pure Southern obligation. But the damage was done. The Queen of Compliance had fallen, both literally and figuratively, and the kingdom was watching. If you thought that fall was messy, wait till you see what comes next. Because mud washes off, but fraud leaves a stain. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and don't blink. The popcorn rebellion has only just begun. At 5:29 a.m., the world was still mostly asleep, except for Frank Holloway, who believed mornings were for Marines, mischief, and messages that didn't need envelopes. At 5:30 on the dot, he fired up the Caterpillar D6 like it was the opening act at a Freedom concert. The rumble shook the dust off the siding. I was brushing my teeth when the sound hit me. Diesel-fueled defiant. I stepped outside in pajama pants and work boots, like any reasonable man preparing for civil disobedience. Neighbors poured out of their homes, robes, slippers, coffee mugs in hand, drawn not by chaos, but by something better, justice on treads. The sun hadn't even cracked the sky, but the moment already felt bright. Frank climbed onto the machine like it was a pulpit, saluted the flag on the community center lawn, and let the blade speak its mind. The first panel of fence didn't stand a chance. Frank eased the bulldozer forward with the precision of a surgeon and the attitude of a man who'd been waiting for this since the first HOA notice hit our mailbox. Cedar boards cracked like fireworks. Screws popped loose, metal braces folded like paper clips in a microwave. By the time the second section dropped, someone, probably Leo, was already live streaming on Facebook. Operation Road Freedom, the caption read. Cheers erupted from the crowd. Ruth was waving a dish towel like a victory flag. One guy started playing Proud to be an American on a Bluetooth speaker from his front porch. It wasn't just a demolition, it was an exorcism. Elaine's fence wasn't just in the way, it was the problem. And now it was crumbling. One glorious crunch at a time. That's when the police arrived. Or rather, the police. Deputy Carl Brenner stepped out of his cruiser, wearing his uniform like it was a second skin and squinting at the scene like a man who'd seen worse, but not by much. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered, spotting Frank behind the controls. Turns out, Carl and Frank had served in the same Marine unit back in the day. Carl didn't reach for his radio. He reached for Frank's hand. Been a long time, Gunny. Elaine came storming out from her house seconds later, half-dressed, fully enraged, and screaming about destruction of property, emergency injunctions, and felony charges. Carl let her rant, then calmly asked to see her construction permits, city approval records, and survey documentation for the fence. Silence. The kind that smells like panic and sweat. Elaine stammered something about verbal authorization and executive HOA discretion. Carl just shook his head. Ma'am, I can't arrest a man for removing an illegal structure, especially not from land that doesn't belong to you. And that's when Ruth stepped forward, manila envelope in hand, like the final witness in a courtroom drama. I think you'll want to hear these, she said, handing over a digital recorder. Carl pressed play. Elaine's voice came through crystal clear, cold and casual, detailing her plan with Alan Greaves to reallocate HOA funds toward personal legal fees. Another clip, Elaine coaching someone on how to find residents strategically to push them out. The last one? A conversation about inflated bids, kickbacks, and fake contracts for neighborhood improvements that never happened. The crowd went quiet. Not out of shock, but out of clarity. The fog was gone. We weren't just victims of overreach. We were marks in a long con. And now, the mask was off. Carl didn't say much. He didn't have to. He handed the recorder to his partner, asked Ruth for a written statement, and turned to Elaine. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with us while we review this evidence." She sputtered, refused, cried, and finally surrendered. The image of her being escorted to the cruiser while Frank sat on the bulldozer sipping coffee is something I'll carry to my grave. As they pulled away, a neighbor muttered, "Well, that escalated beautifully." The fence was gone. The fear, even more so. And what Frank had bulldozed wasn't just wood and wire, it was the paper-thin wall of intimidation that had kept people quiet for far too long. This wasn't just poetic justice, it was neighborhood therapy done in diesel and daylight. Think that was satisfying? Wait until you see what the investigation uncovers next, because when the smoke clears, sometimes you find more than debris. You find the truth buried underneath. Subscribe now, hit that bell, and stay tuned. The final showdown's coming, and it's louder than any bulldozer. They booked Elaine Prescott under 6 charges: fraud, misuse of HOA funds, obstruction, and a few others the district attorney said took some creative reading of the civil code. That arrest didn't just close a chapter, it opened a floodgate. Within 2 weeks, neighbors were coming out of the woodwork with stories, receipts, voice memos, and screenshots. Turns out, the fence wasn't the only thing she'd built without permission. HOA funds had gone towards spa weekends, a personal legal retainer, and, most absurdly, a leadership retreat at a luxury ranch where the only leadership being practiced involved brunch menus and wine pairings. But something funny happened after Elaine left. The neighborhood started breathing again. People waved more, dogs barked less, and the road, finally free, got a fresh layer of gravel. We started calling it Liberation Road, not because we were being dramatic, but because it fit. Some roads lead to your house, this one led us back to each other. What followed wasn't just punishment, it was reform. Nora worked with the city council to draft new HOA transparency requirements. Ruth, somehow busier in retirement than most people with 3 jobs, rallied support for term limits and a resident's Bill of Rights. And someone, probably Leo, submitted our story to a state representative. 3 months later, the state passed legislation officially dubbed Mason's Law, making it mandatory for HOAs to provide publicly auditable financial records and giving homeowners clearer pathways to challenge rogue leadership. I didn't ask for the name, but I'll admit, it felt good. Like planting something sturdy in the soil after pulling out a weed with a backhoe. Frank, of course, just grunted and said, "Next time we start with the bulldozer." And while I appreciated the sentiment, part of me knew the bulldozer wasn't just a tool that day. It was a symbol, a reminder that justice doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears grease-stained boots and revs at 6 a.m. 6 months later, Elaine came back. Not to run for HOA president, thank God. She showed up at my doorstep one quiet afternoon wearing jeans, a plain t-shirt, and an expression I'd never seen on her before. Humility. No clipboard, no sunglasses, no entourage. Just her, holding an envelope and a quiet apology. "Mason, I don't expect anyone to forgive me, but I needed to say this in person." Inside the envelope was a check, $15,000, 0 cents toward the restitution fund for neighbors she'd wronged. Her court deal included mandatory community service and a 5-year ban from any HOA board. But she'd gone a step further, volunteering at the senior center, helping Ruth with yard work and organizing grocery runs for the folks she once fined. And as odd as it was to say, it didn't feel fake. Elaine looked like someone who'd lost everything, and in the rubble found the one thing she'd never cared for before, a community. We kept going. Ruth was elected as HOA secretary, a title she insisted on accepting only if no one made her wear a name tag. Leo ran a monthly open forum for homeowners. Nora helped revise the HOA charter to limit fines, ensure voting rights, and eliminate vague clauses that could be twisted into tyranny. and every June we started celebrating what became known unofficially but proudly as Fence Down Day. Kids painted signs, adults grilled ribs, neighbors who hadn't spoken in years now debated sauce recipes and swapped mulch tips. Frank even gave speeches, well, brief ones, but the crown jewel of the event? The old yellow Bulldozer. Frank donated it to the local VFW hall, where it now sits on a concrete platform, polished and proud, with a plaque that reads, "Sometimes the fastest way to build community is to tear something down first." I watched as kids climbed it like a jungle gym, laughing like they'd never lived under fear, and maybe, for the first time, they hadn't. Looking back, it's easy to say the battle was about a fence, but that was just the start. That fence stood for something bigger, fear dressed up as policy, power hiding behind process. We didn't just tear down wood and steel, we tore down the silence, the suspicion, the passive, "well, that's just how it is" attitude that had settled into every street like pollen in spring, and in its place, we built something wild and rare. Not perfect, not shiny, but real. Built on barbecues, shared stories, and the unspoken bond that comes from surviving something absurd together. Some fences keep out danger, others keep out decency, and some just need a bulldozer and a reason. And as I sat on my porch that evening, watching kids race down Liberation Road on bikes with squeaky brakes and streamers fluttering like victory flags, I realized something that hadn't quite hit me before. This story, our story, was never just about an HOA or a fence or even the bulldozer that turned a barricade into firewood. It was about people waking up, about learning that you don't need permission to stand up for what's right, that sometimes dignity is something you have to defend 1 inch, 1 neighbor, 1 voice at a time, and sometimes the loudest statement you can make is simply refusing to stay quiet. What we learned? That control can dress itself up in good intentions, that bullies don't always knock, they send letters, that power can hide in plain sight behind a compliance form. But more importantly, we learned that unity doesn't come from rules. It comes from resilience, from a retired Marine with calloused hands and a heart that doesn't back down, from a community that chose each other over fear, from everyday people who decided that silence wasn't loyalty, it was surrender. So if this story made you feel something, anger, hope, laughter, justice, then it did its job. Because HOA didn't know wasn't just about tearing something down, it was about building something better in its place. Transparency, courage, and the kind of neighborhood that waves first and worries later. If you believe stories like this matter, if you think more people need to be reminded that fences don't just block roads, they block connection, then drop a comment below, share your own HOA battle, or just say what part hit you hardest. Smash that like button if you know someone who could use a little bulldozer energy in their life, and don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just be the one that gives you the blueprint for your own Liberation Road. See you next episode, neighbor.